Welcome everyone. I know people will be still jumping on. I'm looking at the number of attendees and I'm expecting at least a doubling of it. I'm gonna quickly do the housekeeping rules and then I'm going to introduce President Rosenberg, who'll be moderating today's session. Very quickly, our presenters today, I said welcome to Dr. Scott Cowen. We're very grateful for you taking the time to talk with us today. Our presenters are going to be the only ones with microphone access. Everyone else will be muted until the Q&A portion. When we get to the Q&A, you'll be able to ask questions in two ways. If you look to the bottom of your screen, which is the most familiar, there's a chat box, you can write it in, but we're also going to have a verbal question and answer option. So if you look at if you see my little picture, if you look at the top of your screen, you can see a hand. If you want to ask a question, click the hand and I will open up your microphone and you can ask the question. And that is how we will organize our Q&A scenario. So we appreciate you being here. And so with that, I want to move over to President Mark Rosenberg, who is the president of Florida International and the chair of the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities, to kick off our webinar.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being involved, and particularly thanks to Scott Cowen. This is a conversation that's incredibly timely on the heels of Harvey, Irma, and Maria. We've probably never seen more concentrated damage and calamity in and around the Caribbean than what's happened over the last month, and we're not done yet. But the challenges are emblematic of challenges in particular that our urban serving institutions as anchor institutions have, and they're emblematic of the kind of responsibility that ultimately we can take as it relates to the coordination of actions leading up to, if there's that kind of time available, as well as the response to once the event has occurred. And really, there's nobody better to help us think this through and to begin what I expect will be a longer conversation than Scott Cowen, who's President Emeritus of Tulane. He's author of The Inevitable City, The Resurgence of New Orleans and the Future of Urban America. I've been privileged to know Dr. Cowen for almost 3 decades. Whatever he does, he brings the panache of a visionary and a leader. And in the case of Tulane and New Orleans, Scott would never say it, but many will tell you that if it weren't for his post-event leadership, it would have been hard for Tulane to recover, but even more importantly, harder for New Orleans to recover. So Scott, thank you. I'm really proud that you can lead this series off, and we're looking forward to your comments. I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Good, thank you, Mark, and welcome to everybody listening to this webinar today. I'm privileged to be here with you and to share some thoughts. I thought I would cover 3 topics, and I will try to do it in about 15 minutes or so, to allow plenty of time for you to ask your questions. First of all, I'll describe my Katrina experience, what happened in the immediate aftermath of Katrina, how we went about our recovery, and how we went about a transformation of the university. I will do it at a relatively high level because of time, but later on I'll be glad to get into the details. But most importantly, I'll also share with you some lessons that I learned about disaster planning and recovery because of what we went through. There are many things that we did well, and there were many things that we could have done a lot better than we do, and I'll try to share both with you. Let me start about talking about the impact that Katrina had on New Orleans and on Tulane University. This is simply to provide a context. People I've heard on the radio and the TV compare Katrina to Harvey, to Irma, to Nate, to everyone. And the fact of the matter, they're all different and they're all tragedies, and people are suffering. So you never want to measure the magnitude of the tragedy by how many people died, how many homes, because every situation is different. So when I go through the Katrina story, you'll at least understand in our context in New Orleans and Tulane, and I would say this for Dillard University, And for Xavier University and Loyola University, all sister and brother institutions of ours in New Orleans, they went through the same thing. First of all, the impact on New Orleans. About 1,800 people lost their lives. Most of them died in the floodwaters or asphyxiation, or because there was no lack of medical care to take care of them when they got sick. 400,000 jobs were lost. 275,000 homes were destroyed. By the way, that's 10 times as many as any other U.S. natural disaster. Now, we haven't seen the numbers coming out of the most recent storms, but I suspect the number of homes destroyed in New Orleans still was a very large number. The total cost in damages to really the community, the wider community, was about $160 billion. And at least at that time in 2005, it was the third deadliest and most expensive hurricane in U.S. history. It obviously took its toll on Tulane University. We have two major campuses in New Orleans. One is our Uptown campus, which has everything other than our medical school, our School of Public Health, and our hospital. So if you look at the Uptown campus, 70% of that main campus was flooded, and our entire Health Sciences Center campus downtown was flooded. It resulted in about 13,000 students and 8,000 employees being dispersed for 5 months. Matter of fact, as you may know, we were forced to close the entire university for 5 months so that we could be properly recover and reopen. But even more importantly, so New Orleans had that opportunity, because even though we felt we probably could get up and running sooner than 5 months, the city was not prepared, quite honestly, to have another large organization open up before they were. And Tulane at that time was the largest private employer in Orleans Parish, and the second largest landowner in the parish. Best of my knowledge, and this is not something I'm proud of at all, but we probably became the first major U.S. university to close its doors for an entire semester when we did so in the fall of 2005. And what was also very disheartening to me during that period of time, the number of people around the country that said that Tulane would never reopen again, and if it did, it would be so diminished that it would never be the institution it was before. When you add together all the losses we had in Katrina, it was $650 million. Put that in perspective, at that time, we probably had a budget of about $850 million. So this was a substantial number, however, whatever metric you use. And I'll talk a little later on about insurance and about FEMA and the recovery of some of those losses. There were really 3 stages that we went through in terms of rebuilding our organization. I call them simply survival, recovery, and transformation. Survival was just the few days around the storm and the week thereafter, where we really didn't know what was happening in terms of the amount of damage of the storm. So it was very hard to plan and figure out what to do. I will tell you this. I thought we had an excellent hurricane plan. I really do. It had been tested at least 3 or 4 times before while I was president with other hurricanes, and it did very, very well. But I found out it had 2 significant deficiencies. One is we never anticipated a catastrophic event like Katrina. So when we thought about hurricanes, we thought about a normal hurricane, which would come in, do some damage, and move on. We might be closed for a couple of days. And we never thought that it would have the depth and breadth of damage that it did have. So the most important learning I walked away from is all of us who are doing our disaster recovery plans, whether it's for a hurricane or an active shooter or for some disease that spreads on our campus, you have to think about, what if the most catastrophic and unbelievable thing happens, what would you do? That was a very significant learning for us, and one that we have taken seriously since then by putting in a very robust risk management system now at the university that tries to anticipate anything that could happen, and especially if it would be catastrophic, and what we might do. The other big mistake we made, which quite honestly was on me because I didn't think about it, was the location of our information technology system and infrastructure. Our system was in New Orleans, our backup was in New Orleans, And of course, when Hurricane Katrina came, we had no access to any of those particular systems. That was a big problem in terms of communication, and we have since learned from that one, and our backup systems now are nowhere in the state of Louisiana. They're in a very safe place, so if it happened again, we would be prepared. We, by the way, were able to get our IT systems up and running very quickly, only because one of our alums of Tulane University was the co-founder of Yahoo, and he was able to put us on his servers during those very critical days and weeks after Katrina. During the survival phase, I think there were several other things that we thought about. First and foremost always is the safety and welfare of the faculty, staff, and students. And once again, we had a very effective evacuation plan for everyone that did work. The evacuation plan for New Orleans didn't work, but it did for Tulane University. We also had sites in Jackson, Mississippi for students to go to, and we had sites in Houston, Texas for key staff members to go in the event that they had to evacuate and we had to gather in Houston. That was one of the things that we actually had correct. One of the other things we had built into our hurricane planning was that every single person, faculty, staff, and student, should have an individual plan prepared for themselves of what they would do. If they were going to evacuate, where would they evacuate to? If they were going to shelter in place, where would they do that? So we were pretty strict and structured in making sure everybody had their own plan. Even with that said, we had about 800 students who could not evacuate right before the storm, but we were prepared with buses who took them to Jackson, Mississippi. During the survival phase, the second thing was to secure the campus. As I said, we are the second largest landowner in Orleans Parish. We have 2 major campuses and several other satellite campuses. We were able to do that well before the storm. We had at least 24 hours, and our plan was set up that we knew how to secure them. The third thing was communication, because one of the most important lessons I learned from Hurricane Katrina was the necessity to continually communicate with a rhythm and a timetable for your communications, because people at a time like this are unbelievably anxious, and the best way to help them is to give them information about the status of the campus, the status of New Orleans, and that communication has to be factual, reality-based, and also have an opportunity to create some hope for them about what will be next steps and where we think the institution is going, as well as the city. So communication was important. I was very pleased. Our plan had a very good communications plan and a rhythm to it, and it worked. And a matter of fact, for several days and weeks after the storm, the Tulane website was probably the most valuable information for any New Orleanian to go to because of our ability to get out information about what was happening in the city and our university. The next one is damage assessment. As soon as you possibly can, to make an assessment of damage, not of just of your campuses, but the status of housing, schools, hospitals, anything that your faculty, staff, and students need to be apprised of. So even if they can get back, do they have a school to send their children? Do they have a hospital to go to? Do they have a grocery store? So damage assessment is very, very critical. When it came to the remediation of the campus, we actually had a firm, Belford, it's out of Florida, I believe, that is a specialty, if you will, company that comes into campuses or areas after a catastrophe and helps to rebuild them. And believe it or not, we had them on site, I think, within 1 week after the storm, even though we didn't have any power, we didn't have any water on our campus or in the city for that matter, but they had they were on the campus and they were starting to rebuild our campuses. I think the other thing during the survival part, which as I said was that critical 1 week or 2 weeks after the storm, we made 3 very important decisions after Katrina, which I think set the tone. The first thing is we got out to everybody as soon as we can that we would pay every single faculty member and staff member no matter how long the university was closed. That turned out to be extremely important because, once again, the faculty and staff, their homes, their lives were disrupted, and what they didn't need to know was there could be a disruption in their pay. We took that fear away from them. The second thing we said, and this was a week after, that we would open up in January of '06. And we made that proclamation at a time, quite honestly, where we had no idea that we could even open up January of '06. But we had to set a target for ourselves. We had to set a target for everybody who believed in us. And to say, this is what we're aspiring to. And we're all focused on that single goal of reopening in January of '06. So symbolically and substantively, that made a big statement. And the third thing, which was very, very helpful, and I hope those of you who have gone through these tragedies have availed yourself of it, I was able to gather the heads of all the higher education authorities in the United States, ACU, the AAU, APLU, you name the list. I got them on the phone at one time. And they were remarkably helpful, not just to me, but also to the other institutions, with getting communications out to other universities around the country that they should open up spaces in their college and university for our students to come for a semester. That if they had spaces for our faculty to come, especially research faculty, that they provided. I will tell you, I think the higher education sector was the greatest hero in my book of who helped us the most very, very rapidly, and it was so those associations. The next step, once we knew that we at least survived, we didn't know what the institution would look, we went through what we call the recovery stage. And there were two parts to that recovery, and once again, I'll do it at a high level. One was to continue to rebuild our campus, but it was also to reach out to our faculty and staff and students to find out where would they live. And we had to be very creative in creating additional places for people to live when they came back, if they in fact didn't have a place to go. We did that by resurrecting some temporary housing. We leased a cruise ship to come down the Mississippi River, house people on a cruise ship, and did a number of other things to provide housing for those who needed it. At the same time, since the hospitals were all closed, we created a makeshift health clinic that could serve our population while the hospitals were reopening. Likewise, we were able to take control of a public school and get that opened. We gave money to the public school. All the other schools were closed. We were able to get one open so the children of our faculty and staff could go there. So there were a number of issues that we took on, not just to rebuild our physical campus, but to rebuild aspects of adjacency, if you will, services that needed to be there in order for people to come back. That was all during the recovery phase, and that was quite detailed, and I could go into the detail later on if you'd like. The other aspect that was important to us, and Mark graciously mentioned it, was since we were the largest private employer in Orleans Parish and the second largest landowner, we got very involved in helping the city of New Orleans plan their destiny and get involved with it. I'll give you one simple example. The mayor at that time formed a new commission. It was called the Bring New Orleans Back Commission. It was a group of 17 people to develop a plan to rebuild New Orleans. I was then subsequently asked to chair the education, the K through 12 education part of it, to develop a new vision and strategic plan for public education. We developed that over a period of 6 months. That plan was implemented, and it's considered a very big success for us in New Orleans and others around the country. Likewise, there were similar task force looking at the healthcare system and other aspects of the community. I felt it was important that Tulane get involved, not only because of our sheer size, but we have a talent base in our faculty, staff, and students that, quite honestly, was very, very powerful. And by lending our minds and hands to the rebuilding the community, that really established a whole new relationship between us in New Orleans, one that we never had before, to the point where New Orleans has a much better feel for Tulane than it ever had before that storm. We realized probably in November that we would in fact be able to open in January, but we realized there was one other thing. We could never reopen the way we were before. And the reason was because of the amount of financial cost of doing everything we were doing, and the fact that we knew many students would not come back to the university. We decided to say we have to renew ourselves. We have to re-envision the university. And that took a period of about 2 months. I won't go through the detail of that, but someone else, I remember at the time, labeled it the largest restructuring of an American university in well over a century. And we did do a number of things. It was all geared towards, really quite honestly, 3 objectives. One is becoming financially viable, because if we had done nothing, we were projected to lose at least $100 million a year. But you all know you cannot sustain that for more than a year or two. So we had to make sure we were viable. The second thing is we wanted to preserve and enhance the quality, distinctiveness of our academic programs. And third, we wanted to re-envision Tulane in a slightly different way than it was before. And ours was all around the concept of engaged, place-based learning. And we got very involved then into social innovation, social entrepreneurship, design thinking. I think we're probably one of a few, or maybe the only major research university that integrates public service into the core curriculum for all undergraduate students. And that became part of that as our commitment to not only New Orleans, but to the future of our university, our community, and the country. Those changes, we eliminated a lot of departments. We had to terminate tenured faculty. We had to jettison about 1,000 people. All of that was incredibly painful. We tried to do all of that using data we had about programs and individuals. But as you may know, we ultimately got censured by the AAUP because of it, as did every university in Louisiana get censured for it. I thought they had made a huge mistake doing that for many reasons, but we did what we had to do for the sake of our institution. With the benefit of hindsight, those changes we made as part of what we call the renewal plan has had a profound positive impact on Tulane. But I would say this, it took us a good decade to fully recover from Hurricane Katrina. One of the things, for example, was normally our entering undergraduate class would be about 1,600 students. We were very pleased when we found that 87% of our undergraduates came back, in January of '06. That surprised us. We had thought maybe it would only be 50 or 60%. So what we didn't anticipate was that the following fall, instead of getting 1,600 students, only 823 came. Now you all know you are then with those students for 4 years, and the impact that has on the culture of the campus, your budget, and everything else. One of the reasons that the class was so low, we made a conscious decision not to reduce academic standards, to keep them the same they were before Katrina, but we suffered a loss in students. Even the year thereafter, only 1,200 students came. The year after, 1,400 students came. And you all could go through the math, you do graduation rates and retention rates. So it took us well over a decade to flush through all, if you will, all the implications of Hurricane Katrina. It really did. And I just mentioned one impact that it had just on, in terms of student head count, and then the impact that has on retention rates, graduation rates, rankings, you name it. But thankfully we are now through that and look a lot better than way before Katrina. And I would say to you, I would never wish a tragedy on anyone, but there are silver linings, and there were silver linings for New Orleans, and there was silver lining for Tulane. So just a couple last points I would mention, then I'll stop because I want to really get to your questions. Once again, the importance of developing a very detailed and tested protocols for handling all types of emergency risks is necessary. As I said, we have put in a fairly sophisticated emergency risk management program that we now have at the university. And in that plan, we even think about the unthinkable and try to feel what we might do with catastrophes. That was important. The second thing is, and I would advise this to all of you, read very carefully all the insurance policies you have. If you have not done that, get lawyers to do it, because we had a very difficult time recovering insurance that we thought on had property and other forms of insurance. I would also tell you, if you go through a disaster and you have to deal with FEMA, even though FEMA is much better today than it was in 2005, you need to hire FEMA experts to help you get through that maze of documenting and recovering funds from FEMA. And that's very, very important as well. The last thing I would say about it is, I found during the time of Katrina that not all of my senior staff was built for catastrophes and disasters. And it's very important that you be aware, if there is such a thing, if there are senior officers who cannot perform quickly and decisively, you have to make a change right away. You cannot afford the luxury of trying to train somebody when you're in the midst of a disaster itself. So I learned a lot about the characteristics of people who did well during a disaster and those that did not. And as I hired after Katrina people, I began to look more and more for people that had some of those characteristics that I admired. Resilience, grit, things that just sound like buzzwords, but when a real crisis comes around, they're important. So Mark, let me stop there because I covered a lot of ground at a fairly high level, and probably be more useful for me now just to take questions from the group.
Okay, this is Sherry, and I'm going to invite people to raise the reminder. You can raise your hand by clicking the hand, or you can write your questions in the chat box. We'll give you a minute to do that. And while we're waiting for people to figure out the technology, can I start with my own question, if that's okay?
Sure.
One of the things you mentioned during the presentation was that the higher ed community was one of the strongest support. So could I ask you more practically, moving forward, what can the higher ed, how can we think about providing support for our institutions and our members? What was most help to you, or what would you have needed that you didn't get?
Yeah, I got everything we needed, and the most important thing was, up until that time, it may exist now, I don't know that the higher education authorities, and it was about 7 or 8 as I recall, would normally just come together every time there was a disaster and proactively reach out to a university. So one of the things that I hope has occurred, and if it's not, maybe you could be the spearhead for it, is perhaps every organization should have a contact person that in the event of a disaster of some kind, it's easy for university presidents or their senior staff to get a hold of that association, to talk to them and perhaps convene all of them to talk about their situation as well as others in the city. Now, what they did for us was very valuable. First of all, they got out the word very quickly to all the other colleges and universities in the United States that the students from Tulane, Dillard, Xavier, and Loyola were going to be displaced for a semester. And they asked whether any of those colleges and universities could take those students in for a semester, even though the semester had already started in many of those institutions, not charge them tuition, and not allow them to transfer in January of '06. That in and of itself was unbelievably important to all of us, especially to Tulane University. And our students attended over 597 different colleges and universities in the United States. And the vast majority of those 597 universities and colleges honored those conditions. But what made it happen quickly was the power, the collective power of those 7 or 8 higher education associations in getting the word out, and then being a conduit, back to me and the other presidents of the New Orleans institutions.
Okay,
Scott,
great.
Scott, this is Mark Rosenberg. On that matter, can you hear me, Scott?
I can hear you.
Okay, on that matter, there's a state of the art that you refer to, and let me just describe for you what happened with us. We at FIU took in 121 students from Tulane. Of the 121 students, I'm happy to report to you that actually 120 returned to the institution in January. When we, and this may have been our inadequacy, but when we enrolled those 121 students, we had to enroll them as freshmen because there was no documentation. It was just how our system worked. There really was no documentation available to certify, where they were, whether it was a transfer. So the easiest way to was enroll them as freshmen. But subsequent to that, when our 6-year graduation rate for 2005, then, we were accountable for that. We actually took a hit in our 6-year graduation rate because those students were enrolled and then they disenrolled, for the second semester. And we're still explaining that to the Board of Governors. So I don't know whether the state of the art has changed, but you did what you had to do and we did too, but we ended up getting hurt by that. Fortunately, it wasn't that consequential and we did the right thing. But I do think, Sherry and Scott, that maybe there needs to be, a modality that there's kind of, you're held harmless for what you've done. And that wasn't the case. Not your problem, but.
But I totally agree with you. And it's interesting, Mark, I had never heard this story until right now. It's unbelievable to me that places like U.S. News and World Report, that's the one we look at, wound up harming institutions that did the right thing. Just by the way, as it harmed us as an institution, they didn't make any adjustments that we had Hurricane Katrina. So our rankings, fell from wherever we were in the low 40s to 51, 52. Of course, once 10 years got back, it then climbed back up to number 40 or 39. But they didn't cut us any slack either. And it's one more example about how these rankings are, quite honestly, counterproductive, not only to doing the right thing, but in many times even assessing the quality of an institution, the impact they have on their students. And this might be something that should be brought to their attention. I don't know whether you ever did that with U.S. News, and maybe there were others that also penalized it, but I'm aghast to hear that you had that. Really aghast, geez, for it.
And then let me just, and then I know that there are other people waiting, but let me ask you one other thing. It seems to me that institutions like ours are pretty good at preparing for the event. I know that we have to prepare for the event, but to your point, it was the post-event that there was little preparation for. Could you spend some time on that? And are there any tips? How do you really think through all those scenarios so that you're ready to go on post-event for something that you absolutely hadn't planned for?
Sure. Well, several things I think that were very practical that we implemented ourselves. First of all, we were very clear. We had a plan before, but we really refined it afterwards about where the senior leadership team would go in the, after a disaster. If they could not stay in their city or the university, where would they go? The second thing we talked about is other ways that we could begin to deliver education, primarily online, deliver education, or already have in place a scenario that, you know, we would add another semester at another time so that students could stay on schedule for graduation. So we began to think about those issues. You know, we had on contracts hotels and places, which we do every year, that when it happens, they already know we're coming. And we don't have to worry about where we're going or so on. And that was critical. Same thing with transportation. We have now locked down transportation contracts with anyone to help anyone who needs to escape from Tulane and New Orleans to get out of town. I told you we already moved our IT system. I already told you we now have redone our entire insurance program based on what we learned. We have on contract a remediation company if we needed to come in to remediate. So I think the point is to try to think through in the aftermath, first of all, people. What do you need to have in place for the welfare and caring of your people, faculty, staff, and students? That's the most important. Then it gets to facilities, and what do you need for your facilities? And then various functions like IT, and break it down as granular as you can. And that's why, I don't know, Mark, whether you do it at your institution or not, you know, putting in an enterprise risk management system, which is bottoms up, not just tops down, but bottoms up, is very important because it forces you to think through, if this catastrophe happened, what would you do? And you have all the things as much in place as you possibly can.
Okay, great. It's looking like the people are preferring, the attendees are preferring to write the questions. So what I'll do is I will read them and announce their name. So from Melvin Lewis, after the AAUP disagreed with the reduction in force, what did you do with the 1,000 staff and faculty members?
We didn't change anything. So when we of the 1,000, by the way, the number of faculty, I can't remember exact number, but it was probably about 100, give or take. We had clear policies in our own, if you will, policy statements at the university about when you can dismiss a tenured faculty member, other faculty, even non-tenured, and the kind of severance you had to pay for them. So we followed our own policies and treated faculty just as the policy statement dictated, which previously had been voted on by the Senate itself. That was one of the things that really irritated me about the AAUP. We followed our own policies, which the faculty had voted on many years before, and we got censured because we shouldn't have done those things. So we didn't do, if you will, ad hoc when it came to faculty, cherry picking faculty. We closed departments, and then the faculty at those departments left the institutions. But even then, we did teach outs over a period of 2 years with those departments, and those faculty could stay. So we had very clear provisions. We followed them to the T. And I think the proof of the pudding is, as I recall, there were a few lawsuits with faculty, not many, and none that we lost.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll move to the next question. This is from Charles Bantz. You mentioned the need for disaster functioning senior staff. Can you please say more about the management dynamics? How do you keep teams moving forward together, not for the first week, but for the first year and beyond?
Yeah, very good question. I think probably the biggest thing we did early on was everybody was very focused on survival, and that's obvious, survival. But that doesn't inspire. That motivates, but it doesn't inspire. So we've literally the first time we got together as a senior team, which is about 6 days after the event, because I was on campus and didn't evacuate till later, we came up with that we're going to have 3 phases: survival, recovery, and transformation. And kept balancing the reality of our situation with the hope of the future. And we kept talking about that over and over again. So as we were doing things, we were very clear to say we are doing these things right now for these reasons. But there are positives in the long run we believe that will accrue to them. Primarily to make sure we focus much more as an institution on what we do well, or we have the prospect of doing well in, and being financially viable. And ensuring that once we did this once, we wouldn't have to come back a year or two later and terminate more people. So my belief was that if you have to do something, you do it once. And then you go forward, and you don't do halfway measures. You do it all one time, because you leave tremendous credibility if 2 years later you got to come back and do it again. So it was this notion of always, here's the reality, here are the facts, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And by the way, we think there is some positives at the end here. In our particular case, we believe that the renewal or transformation would help us recover stronger than we were as an institution prior to the storm, which turned out to be the fact. It took a good decade to prove that, but you can see the institution now, and it's doing extremely well. So I think it's that balance back and forth. In terms of the people themselves, you really need to have people who are resilient. If there's nothing else, I would say they have to be resilient. The ability to adapt, to be creative, to deal with hardship. Those are the characteristics more than anything else you need in an individual to go forward. Also helps if they have pretty high emotional intelligence, quite honestly, because they have the ability then of self-control, self-awareness, self-management, nurturing to other people, but being realistic. And I always said, the first thing we have to do is understand what the reality of our situation is. Don't kid ourselves, don't deny it. And then just methodically think about a way to gradually get us to a point where we hope we're at a better place than we were before even the storm itself.
Okay, actually the next question, you may have just answered this in part. I'll read it anyway in case there's more to add. So thank you so much. This is from Wendy Fink. Thank you so much for your interesting presentation. I'd like to hear more about the leadership qualities needed for both handling a disaster and its aftermath. You mentioned resilience. Can you give some specific examples?
Sure. One of my senior officers, I won't mention their name, okay? It was very clear within 4 days or 5 days after the storm that they could not cope with what was going on. They simply couldn't make decisions. They were afraid to make decisions, afraid that they would be the wrong decisions. They wanted to continue to use sort of the same processes we had used before in terms of how we process things. And we didn't have the luxury, quite honestly, of using those processes the way we did before. And decisions had to be made at a little lower level than just the president making them, or otherwise nothing would get done. And I met with the individual, and I said to them, to the person, listen, you were terrific at your job before Katrina. You are not doing now what you need to do for the institution. And I laid out what I thought was the issue. And this is going to sound harsh. And I said, I can give you a week to see if you can now make the adaptation required to really function in a crisis situation. And I'm pleased to say that that person did. And they're still with the university, and they have a wonderful career. There was another person, and what I realized was the strength the resilience that person had themselves to adapt, to change, to changing circumstances. They were living in a little bit of denial because of what happened and was hoping that things would just get better. And we said all during that fall, hope is not a plan. You can't expect somebody else to come and save us. We have to do it ourselves. And I think it sunk in with that person. I had another senior officer where I had the same conversation. It didn't work. I had to dismiss the person. I identified someone who was 2 levels down from where it was a he was, who I had experience with and thought was focused, tough, resilient, put that person in the job on an interim basis, and they performed very, very well for us. So you can see right away how people deal with their stress. And a little bit is you have to have the ability to compartmentalize what's going on. You can focus on the tremendous tragedy that's around you, which is, I can't describe how overwhelming it is. I can tell you the number of times I personally cried at night looking at photos, overwhelmed with what I was seeing, and then somehow put it aside the next morning to get on with it, because otherwise it would have just would have swallowed me and I couldn't have moved forward. So that's the kind of people that you're looking for. They tend to be people who are overachievers, people who've had varied experiences outside the university life, and there may be some other sort of telltale signs of those individuals.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Chris Gagner, University of North Carolina, Charlotte, Office of Emergency Management. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Tulane and the local emergency management office?
Very close. It always has been. So the communications between the university and the New Orleans Emergency Planning Office was close, even long before Katrina. That's very, very important. And it's interesting. I'm glad somebody asked that question because I had a phone call a few weeks ago with one of the institutions in Houston, and my first response was, "Well, have you talked to the mayor's office? What's the connection there?" And they said, "Well, we don't have a close relationship." And I said, "That's a mistake. You have to have it." So ours was very close. As a matter of fact, our senior person in emergency planning was on, even before the storm, I guess a task force that the city person had, so that there was close communication between what was going on. Now, the city had a lot of problems itself, and they hadn't thought through their plan, but the relationship was close and is even closer today.
Great. The next question, Kim Allen, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. How did you manage the process of individuals creating their plans? Did you anticipate any mental health needs during the recovery and rebuild process, and how did you address them? And was there some standardization in the student experience for those who moved to other institutions? So I guess that's 3 questions.
So one was the individual plan. One was, how do you deal with the emotional and psychological? Okay, and what was the last part of that one?
Was there any standardization in the student experience for those who were moved to other institutions?
Okay, first the individual plans. We gave them a broad outline, especially for the students, about what they should think about. I think there were, and I'm going back now a few years, I think there were like 5 or 6 key questions. Where would you go? How would you get there? Etc. Who are the important contacts? So in that sense, we laid out a protocol for them. We also laid out the same protocol for faculty and staff, even though they didn't need it as much because they're New Orleanians and they had been through hurricanes before. We did not require them to hand in their paper, the students, so some had it, some did not. But as part of our orientation to the university, that was a big part of the orientation about their individual plans. And we made sure that even when we had orientations for parents, we let them know that there was an expectation. Was there, after, in the aftermath, months, years later, emotional and psychological problems? The answer is absolutely yes. Someone had done a study, I don't know how many years after Katrina, a few years after, and it was staggering the number of people in the city, including our university, that had post-traumatic stress. We had anticipated that, so we had created, if you will, sort of a log or register of where people could get help if they wanted help, both on campus and in the city. We could have done a better job of that because the amount of post-traumatic stress was much higher than we anticipated, lasted much longer than we had anticipated. So yes, we had some references and sources and some places they could go, but quite honestly, that's an area that you probably need to think about even more broadly and deeply than we did. Standardization, I think I've addressed that. Some was standardized, some was not. And it's hard to standardize a lot of it, but we made some improvements, especially, I think, once again, in the emergency planning, what people would do in the case of it. We certainly have increased our capability, welfare services on campus to get help. That has been done. Standardization, we've done, as I said, a little, but nothing that I could mention that would be significant.
Okay, another question from Melvin Lewis. If you moved or used an area outside the New Orleans area, how did the distance impact decision making?
Yeah, the senior team was located in Houston, Texas, because quite honestly, we couldn't function in New Orleans, so we were there. It functioned because I actually, even though the team was in Houston, every week I spent at least 4 or 5 days in New Orleans and then would fly back to Houston. So did a number of my senior members. So we were on campus, within probably a week of the event, even though we were being housed in Houston, and we would spend a good amount of time each week, on the ground. I remember sleeping in the president's house, on the floor because we had no power, no water, on a mattress, and having a lot of other people, some neighbors and others, sleeping in the house as well during that time. So that's how we kept abreast of what was going on. We were physically there. That's why I stayed on campus. I didn't anticipate it would be what it was. And it was an interesting dilemma. Our hurricane plan actually said that the president was supposed to evacuate, and I did not. And that was always controversial, whether I did the right thing by staying or going. In my own mind, I just had to stay, and there were some pros and cons to it. But we were on the ground, very visible and working hard, within, as I said, about 6 to 8 days after that storm.
Okay, great. That is the last question I have. I'll leave it, give anyone, because we have a couple more minutes. If anyone has a last question, they either want to raise their hand or type in quickly. If not, I'll pass it to Mark Rosenberg to, oh, whoops, I got somebody. Hold on. Charles Bance, I'm opening you're on, Charles. Charles, I opened your microphone. Oh. Hello?
Chair, let me go ahead and pop a question to Dr. Cowen, as Charles maybe is sending it if he doesn't have. The issue of energy, power, post-event in planning for the next event for Tulane, did you tell me about your vision for stockpiling fuel, particularly, let's say, diesel, gasoline? Do you, what is that now? How do you view that? Because I found, at least for Irma, our generators, we're going to last, 24 to 36 hours, and then after that, we were at the mercy of fuel trucks coming in, the contractors, and that's very unreliable. So can you give me some insights on that? Give us some insights on that?
Yeah, good question, Mark. First of all, just the subject of generators. Back then, we had some generators, but not nearly enough. And that proved not only difficult because our buildings couldn't be air conditioned, then we had mold problems every place. but most importantly because of our research and specimens we had. So one of the things we looked at very carefully and made substantial investments in was to have generators, and very powerful and a little longer lasting generators on campus. That was another, I'm glad you mentioned, because that was another very important thing we learned, because we didn't have enough of them in the residence halls, in the research labs, so on. And then the second thing we learned about was what we did with fuel was, when Belfour came in, they came in with the fuel themselves. So they were our supplier, if you will. I understand it now that there are other contracts and avenues that the university has, larger store on campus, but reliable access in the event of an emergency to get fuel if they need it. So yes, that was an important part of it, and I didn't mention that before, but generation, having generators, especially in critical areas where the research specimens and that you need air conditioning, and then having the fuel available, or if you build very reliable sources to get the fuel to you.
Okay, I actually do have Charles's question on that I can read now. First, he says, "Thanks, Scott and Mark. What a great session. I'm looking forward to." Sorry, someone just added a question. "I'm looking forward to teaching leading when bad things happen next semester. This will be required viewing. Any readings you suggest?"
Reading when bad things happen, that's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Scott's book. I mean, come on. Our President Emeritus wrote a book on this, Charles. Hello.
Hey, I don't want to.
Sorry, Scott. I had to do that.
I know. I don't want to tout my own stuff. But what I was smiling was, I was going to say that, but thank you, Mark. I wouldn't say it for myself. What I would really focus on is, in that class, understanding what constitutes bad leadership and what's good leadership. Because what you really need, whether it's a crisis or not, is good leadership. Maybe it's a little bit different because you need some characteristics in crisis leadership that you may not need in the normal times. So I'd spend a hell of a lot of time talking about what really constitutes good leadership and what's the kind of leadership that is really needed in a time of a crisis. I'd spend a lot. And if you want to email me, I'll actually send you some suggestions. I teach a course called The Mythology and Reality of Leadership at Tulane. And that's a topic I cover, and I'll be glad to share with you some of the readings that I have. And you can just reach me at scowen@tulane.edu, and I'll get back to you.
Okay, I have one last question, so I'll ask that, and then we can. So it's from Melvin Lewis, who he wrote he's the director of emergency management at Fayetteville State University. After did the after hurricane restructure move Tulane University forward? And did you implement changes which were necessary over the long term?
Yes and yes. So what happened was the transformation we made, all the changes we made, as I told you, with the benefit of hindsight, really looked like they had the effect that we wanted, and in most cases exceeded it. So if you look at the quality of our students, the number of students, our rankings, any metric you would use, we're in a very good place. And I think a lot of that we attribute to some of the changes we made. So if you ask a student, why did you go to Tulane as an undergraduate, they'll say, I like their commitment to community engagement. They'll say that. Or I like something else. I love that the fact we have a School of Science and Engineering where we brought the engineers together with the scientists in the physical and natural sciences together. The synergy has been powerful. They'll make statements like that. Or we have a single portal now for undergraduate education. So I think the answer is, and history will tell, but if you measure what did it work by where's the university today, I'd say it worked very well. It's hard to see if we had done nothing, I know we would have never survived financially. Could we have done things differently? I suspect you always could. Do I have regrets? Yeah, a couple, but they're not major. You always have regrets on it, but it worked. and as I said, in some cases exceeded it. Now we have 12 years of experience. You know, my only regret, I'll tell you the truth is because of U.S. News and World Report, you know how the data works, right? 6-year graduation rates and all of those things. And then the data's lacked 2 years. You know, I made a prediction that, you know, the rankings are going to shoot up after I retire, because you could tell it. Sure enough, I was right. And I'm delighted for the institution has done that. I wish it happened a little bit sooner, but, you know, it did shoot up dramatically once all the sort of, you know, adverse data got through the system, but it took a lot of years, almost a decade, to get it through.
Okay. I'll just, it's 12 o'clock, so I'll just say thank you very much. I think this was excellent, and I think everyone on the call has benefited greatly, and we've recorded it, so we'll be able to share it widely. And I'll pass it to Mark to say his goodbyes.
I think that for those of you who've never gone through a devastating storm, it is a traumatic experience without a doubt, and I think that the President Emeritus has really helped us to understand that, and in a really masterful way condensed an incredible amount of information and, more important, emotion into this conversation. So Scott, I want to thank you very much, and I know you'll be a resource to as many universities as possible, because if you haven't started thinking about there, those of you who are on it, you do need to start thinking about it, and Scott Cowen would be an incredible guide for you. So thank you very much, President Emeritus Cowen.
All right, thanks, Mark. It's good talking to you, and I hope this was helpful. I don't lay myself out to be an expert, but I lay myself out to be someone who's experienced. And somehow those, yeah, they converge in some ways. Thanks very much. It's nice being with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.